Welcome back. Semi-structured interviews combine predetermined questions with questions that are generated during the interview. In this video, I'll look at how you develop the predetermined questions for your project. Let's begin by looking at the interview guide that we used for our example project. For our example project, we wanted to describe the process by which young adult patients with diabetes transition into adult care. One group of providers we wanted to talk with about this process were pediatric physicians and nurses. Here is the interview guide we used when doing interviews with this group of providers. An interview guide is a data collection instrument. It consists of the predetermined questions you plan to ask during your semi-structured interview. Next to the questions, there's some variation in what else different researchers include on an interview guide. For our project, we only included a title identifying the group the interview guide was designed for. In other words, pediatric physicians and nurses. Other elements commonly included on interview guides include the title of the study, the research objectives, or a space to put the date or who conducted the interview. But the questions are the crucial part of any interview guide. We developed separate interview guides for different groups of participants we wanted to interview. While similar, having separate guides allowed for the questions and the wording to be more appropriate for each type of provider and their likely role within the transition process. It may be hard to determine whether you need a unique guide for a particular group of participants. For example, we could have developed separate guides for the pediatric physicians and the pediatric nurses. You need to consider whether the questions you want to ask a particular group of participants are different enough to warrant a separate guide. Interview guides assist the researcher in conducting interviews. If you think that a separate guide would help with the interviews with a particular group of participants, then you should develop a separate guide. Once you've developed one interview guide for a project, adjusting it for another group can often be done fairly simply. On the other hand, semi-structured interviews do not require that the questions are asked verbatim, so you can always adjust the questions during the interview to accommodate people with different roles or different experiences. This can be done even if using the same interview guide. We discussed this issue with the research team, which included representatives from some of the different types of providers we were planning to interview. For the example project, we ended up developing 5 separate guides for the various types of providers we wanted to interview. These guides were for pediatric physicians and nurses, adult-focused physicians and nurses, diabetes educators, dietitians, and primary care physicians. The number of questions on your interview guide will depend on several considerations. The first and most important would be your research objectives. You want to make sure that the questions you plan to ask can address everything that you're trying to find out. You can even map your interview questions to your objectives to help ensure that all the objectives are covered across all of your interviews. For the researcher, there's usually always more that you want to find out. But you should also consider the perspective of the participant. These are people who are volunteering to engage with you about your project. And like you, they have a lot going on in their lives. In developing an interview guide, always consider how many questions are reasonable to ask this type of participant. Try to balance your research needs with the time and contribution you're asking from your participants. Do not assume that your participants will be available to answer an overly long list of questions. You should also avoid asking so many questions that participants get tired and start just giving short responses. Interviews may also be limited to a set amount of time. For our example project, we assumed most healthcare providers would be available for only 1 hour. There are several factors to consider regarding the length of an interview guide. The appropriate number of questions is influenced by the specific questions you plan to ask. For this reason, the length of any interview guide will not be known until it's finalized. Our interview guide for pediatric physicians and nurses ultimately consisted of 11 questions and 1 follow-up question. Writing and revising your predetermined questions is a key part of planning a semi-structured interview. By the time you've gotten to formulating your questions, you've likely spent a lot of time considering what you want to ask. You should be able to develop some initial questions just by considering the focus of your project and why you wanted to engage a particular group about it. What is the relevant information this group of participants knows that makes you want to engage them? Start by writing these questions down. Some of our questions for pediatric providers were: does your clinic transition young adults with diabetes from pediatric to adult care? Do you feel your patients are usually prepared to make the transition when they do? What suggestions do you have for improving the transitioning of patients with diabetes into adult care? Given the focus of our project, some of these questions may seem obvious to ask. For most projects, especially with targeted participants, it's fine to ask questions that directly focus on what you want to know. There's no need to make your interview guide questions more complicated than necessary. Your questions should reflect your research objectives, so you can review your objectives to see if that helps you identify any additional questions to include. You can ask your research team to suggest questions. For our example project, I'd recently completed similar projects and included some of the questions I previously used. The key is that the questions cover off what you want to discover. Your interview guide can include sub-questions. These are sometimes called probes or follow-ups. Probes remind you to ask about certain aspects of a topic if a participant does not cover it in their initial response to a question. For example, after our question, how does your center prepare young adults for taking more responsibility for their care? We could have included a probe on our interview guide under this question, such as, what educational material are patients given? If the participant discusses educational material in their response to the first question, you will likely not need to follow up with your probe. If not, you can follow up with the probe to make sure that the participant sufficiently covers off that aspect of the topic. You can also include a follow-up question for a particular response. For example, our main question was followed by a sub-question if the participant gave a positive response. Does your clinic transition young adults with diabetes from pediatric to adult care? If yes, at what age? We'd only ask the second question if there was an affirmative response to the first. For a novice researcher, it can be comforting to have probes on your interview guide to ensure that you sufficiently cover key topics. You still need to be engaged in the interview to decide which probes you need to ask. You should also consider your possible probes when estimating how long you'll think it'll take to complete an interview. I also usually include an end question that invites the participant to add anything else they want to say about the topic. For example, the last question of the interview guide for our sample project was, is there anything else you'd like to add about the transition to adult care for your patients? We also included thank you at the bottom of the interview guide to remind us always to thank participants again for their time at the end of the interview. Once you have an initial list of questions, it's key that you edit and pilot your interview guide. Read through your guide imagining that you're conducting an interview. Consider whether your questions easily flow from one to another. Maybe you need to adjust the order you plan to ask the questions. Estimate how long it'll take to complete the interview guide during the interview. If it feels like the interview guide is too long, perhaps you'll need to reduce the number of questions. Think about if there are questions you can remove or combine. Read your research objectives again and consider whether your interview guide still adequately addresses them. Also think about the wording of each question. Consider whether participants are likely to understand everything you're planning to ask them. Try to simplify the wording of your questions if you can. Unless it's important for meeting your research objectives, try to avoid terms or abbreviations you may have to explain during your interview. Different question types, for example, questions starting with how and why, are likely to prompt longer responses. Frame your questions so that they lead to the type of response you want. Get feedback on the interview guide from the rest of your research team. If you're interviewing participants from a group you're not a part of, try to get someone from that group to also review your interview guide. For our example project, we had a small patient advisory committee that provided feedback on all our data collection instruments. We had healthcare providers with experience in diabetes also review all our interview guides. You can also do a practice interview to see if there are any further adjustments to your interview guide that are needed before using them in the field. The questions you ask directly impact the data you'll get. It's important then to have an interview guide that you're comfortable with and have confidence in. This confidence comes from putting a good deal of consideration into the questions you plan to ask. Now that we have our interview guide ready, in the next video, we'll look at developing and executing a recruitment plan for your project. Thanks for watching.